So, hi everybody. My name is Charlie Peters. I'm the production dramaturg on The Secret in the Wings by Mary Zimmerman, and this is.
Hi, I'm Liz Hobbs, and I am directing The Secret in the Wings.
You absolutely are. So, thanks for chatting with me. So, this is just an opportunity for us to learn a little bit about kind of what you've been crafting for your process, what it is about this play that appeals to you, and so let's chat. So, my first question is exactly that: like, why this play? Why The Secret in the Wings? What drew you to it?
Um, well, I uh, read it the first time I read it. Initially, I love big cast shows. I love physical theater shows. I was looking for something that I could do physical theater, like integrate physical theater and text together. Like that's my whole thing that I'm interested in. So that was kind of the parameter of what I was looking for to begin with. And this show seemed like it might be a good fit. And I read it, and I had absolutely no idea what it was about. I was delighted by it. I was like, it's so theatrical, it's so imaginative, it's so inventive, it's wild, it's all over the place. I have no idea what's going on, but I'm totally excited by it. So, which I think is always a good place to start on a play. Like, I feel like if I read something and I immediately get it and it's just like, oh, well, whatever, then there's not that much that I'm excited about digging into. So the fact that I really had no idea what I was about to begin with was part of the reason that it appealed to me, because I was like, this is so exciting. What is it?
But you had this intuitive like love for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That I was delighted and intrigued by it. So there we are. And then after I started digging into it, read it a few more times and got over like kind of initial like, what is this wild thing I just read? Started realizing that it's really about, what the play is actually about, despite the fact that it's all over the place and there's like it's fairy tales, it's insane, there's people dying and getting married and whatever, and all sorts of tearing their own eyes out and whatever hilarious nonsense that fairy tales always contain. They're gruesome and weird and wild, but underneath all of that, I think that the essential take home thing that the play is saying is that the other, like it's about connection with the other, right? Like it's about how do we connect with another human, another person, just or another thing, another something that is outside of self, by recognizing that the other is actually just an extension of self, and that kindness and generosity towards the other is the only way that we're kind of going to be able to survive this weird life on this weird planet that we live on. And especially right now, I think it speaks to me a lot in the middle of a pandemic where we've all kind of been really isolated for over a year now, and and there's a lot of fear in the world, and there's a lot of people who are really angry at each other, at the government, at whatever. People want somebody to blame something on. People are afraid, like that. I think that message of kindness and generosity and the other as extension of self is even more important right now than it's always important. I truly believe that is true of the world regardless of the status of a pandemic, but especially right now it really resonates because we're so isolated from one another, and it is so easy to forget at the moment that the other is also human, that right, like people make decisions you're angry about, but like remembering that that person is also human. So I think that's essentially, like, it's a simple message, but it's a really true one. And because it's filtered through the lens of fairy tales and the lens of a child, there's something even more beautiful about it, like that it's, again, kind of remembering that the simplicity, not to say that childhood is simple, that's a stupid thing adults say all the time and it's not true, but that there is a simplicity to a child's view of the world when it comes to kindness and generosity, that is actually our impulse as children, in a way that we, I think, lose as we become adults. So the play is not for kids, it's not, right, like, but it is, I think, a good reminder to adults to remember to see through the lens of a child's view of the world, because it's exist. So anyway,
and there's
that's
lots
what I like to play.
That's lovely. And a great little segue into, because the play it presents itself in a very unique, shall we say, way. Like it is a scripted play, there is a text, but it's more than that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, one of the things Zimmerman says about her own writing is that the text is only one instrument in an orchestra, which I love. It's such a great way of explaining it, right? Like in a lot of theater, the text, like it's what we call text-based theater, I guess, or whatever. But that the words are the thing that take primacy. That everything else is created to support the text and the words, which is great, but that's not really what she's asking for in this process. I mean, when she created the show, she was working in a room with actors without a completed script, and was bringing pieces, things in. Like it really was a very much of a devising process, even though she is the playwright. So that's how she created it, and so that structure is very much reflected in the show that she has now published. So then you look at that published show as a director going, okay, well, I'm not devising the scripts around this play, but it calls for so much creative devising work within staging it, because that's how it was created in the first place. So there's kind of almost a weird reverse engineering kind of thing of devising in order to get back to the text. Like you have to devise in order to be able to understand the text in a way that is not very typical in a process in terms of approaching how to stage a play with a bunch of people in a room.
So when you say devising, what does that mean to you? What do you mean by that?
I mean, I always view devising as a very specific type of creation process where it's a lot more open-ended and non-prescriptive than like, oh, okay, well, we have this scene or this text, what is happening? Okay, well, what do you want? So I'm moving towards, like, I mean, in a way, all theater is devising, right? Like you're always creating movement, you're creating like all that stuff. But to me, it's taking it out of the literal and putting it into a more abstract frame, right? So in a very specific way. So one of the tools, the devising tools that I really like to use is using ritual, which I learned from David Kennedy, that I love, right? So it's finding 6 prompts that are intellectual, physical, and kind of idea-based that get at a moment in a scene or the idea of a scene or whatever, right? Like you can kind of craft whatever it is, and then you get the actors to create whatever, like, their version of that ritual is, using these 6 rather abstracted prompts that I've spent a bunch of time coming up with, because they're getting at something that I think is in that text and then they get to discover that themselves through a physical on their feet approach, rather than sitting around and having an intellectual debate about what may or may not be happening in a moment, right? Like it's to me, it's about learning the show and creating meaning without sitting down and nailing it to a piece of text, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
It does. And I hear you talk about like physicalizing. So those abstract things end up with a tangible form, right?
Yeah, because I mean, it's not like we're not in an English lit class in rehearsal, right? Like we're not there to discuss themes and philosophy and whatever. Like that's not helpful in terms of staging a show, because what we're doing is physicalizing these ideas and thoughts and things on stage. And so by approaching it from a creation based place as opposed to a intellectualized place, then we learn it in our physicality, in our bodies, in whatever, and we discover all kinds of super exciting things that we may never have discovered if we were trying to approach it from a literal place, right? Like, oh well, the boy carries the princess into the tomb, so what do we do in staging? Okay, well, like, right, like that there's a literal translation from page to stage that is in some ways limiting, because it you're just going, oh well, that's what it is, so we do it. And then by using a bunch of these devising techniques that are, and a lot of them are techniques that I've learned from doing like devising without a script, right? Or from companies that devise without scripts, and it's basically all the same techniques that I use when I'm creating a show that doesn't have a script, but we have a script, right? So
Right.
it's in some ways the script acts as the guiding idea, the guiding frame, in the same way that when you're devising a play without a script, you go, okay, well, what is the idea? Like, what are we trying to do here, right? So I think there's a lot of overlap between those two things.
Totally. So then I'm curious what that means for you as a director, and how you view your role as a director in relation to like the company that you're leading through that devising, and in relation to the script.
Right. So It's a good question, Charlie. Well, I think in many ways, I guess the director, I am the one creating the frames for the
Right.
work that we're doing, right? So I'm the one that looks at the text, or I take a fairy tale. For example, one of the stories in the play talks about war breaking out. War breaks out. Like, well, what is this war, right? Like, what is the idea of war? What is war? What does it mean to us, et cetera, et cetera. And so rather than going, okay, team, go make a movement piece about war, like that's um I then have to actually really think through what that means to me, and then put it in the context of the play, and how does it make sense with my overall vision, and blah 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 blah, and do all those directorial kind of things. And then I take all of that information that I have in my brain and turn it into a set of like 6 abstracted things that I think might help guide them towards a place of discovery for themselves as to
Right.
what that concept might be in this world, right? So, but those prompts are very carefully created to
Mhm.
frame them ending up in a place that I think is where we want to go with the show. But
Right.
because it's so open and non-prescriptive, I often learn a whole bunch of things from them, or see something that they do and I go, oh my god, that's brilliant, that totally says the thing that I want it to say, or whatever, right? So it's really about my job as director is to create the frame that is going to get us something useful, and
Right.
not just be an exercise and let's do some cool movement. um, but also then to see what they've created, and then like edit from that, like, oh, that moment resonated, or this staging, like this, the what, like even just the proximity that they found in this movement sequence was really neat. And then sometimes it's like it's not even related to the thing that was originally sparked the creation process. But I'm like, oh, that moment is really cool, I think it actually might work someplace else in the show, right?
Right. So you have a crafting sort of a role out of
Yeah,
that.
definitely, definitely. But it's not a show at all where, although I have a very strong physical theater background, like I'm not coming in going, well, here's the choreography for this, and we have a movement coach on this show, and she's also not coming in going, here's your set choreography, learn it. She's creating the same way, and so both of us are acting like working together to kind of pick out what they've created and then shape it and sculpt what they've with the
Mhm.
raw material that they're creating. So yeah, I don't know.
It
Does that
ultimately comes from your company.
Yeah, 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 yeah. All of that comes from them. Yeah.
Really exciting.
Mhm.
I guess the last like sort of question here that relates to this is how do you do all this during COVID? Right? Like you're talking about physical theater in a world where we can't really get close to one another.
Yeah. I mean, it's been challenging for sure. But like in some ways, it's been really great too, right? Like, so a lot of the moments that are in the show, we had to figure out what they actually are, right? Rather than just going, oh, well, a marriage is represented by a kiss on stage. So instead of going kind of like, okay, well, this is how we represent that idea on stage in a pretty traditional way of like, that's what the semiotic systems that we understand are, we kind of have to dig in and like, okay, so what is actual, like, what is marriage in this moment? What is this death? Like, what are these things, and how do we represent them in a way that still tells the story but allows us to stay 6 feet away from each other at all times? um, I guess, yeah, that's the other thing I should say is that one of the things that we're trying to deal with is that we cannot get within 2 meters of each other. We're all masked, like we can't see each other's faces. So there's a whole bunch of interesting challenges that come out of that. So um, one of
But
the ways, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say like challenges, but challenges that invite a creative response, perhaps.
Absolutely. And this show in particular, I think is such a delightful thing to be working on at this time because it is so theatrical and imaginative and inventive. Like it calls for that on a level that I think doing a more traditional show in like a realism world would be much more challenging in some ways. But
Right.
like because for this one, right, like there's all kinds of beautiful little gifts that have come out of this site, out of the fact that we can't get within 6 feet of each other. So like for what I was talking about, carrying a body into a tomb, normally I just would have made sure we understood how to do lifts properly and blah 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 blah, and carried the actor's body into the tomb. But we can't do that. So what do we do instead? She dies and leaves her costume, her cloak behind. Um, when she exits, and her lover, her husband, whatever, goes and picks up the cloak as if it was her body, right? And then he carries the cloak as he would carry her body and lays it out into the tomb. And there's a beautiful poetry to that I really love, right? Like the idea that when someone dies, they're gone, then it's only the shell of them that's left behind, which I think is said so much more profoundly through what we've done in terms of staging than I ever would have been able to come up with on my own if I hadn't had that restriction. Or like there's a partner dance, like there's a wedding dance, right? And I was like, oh God, how do we do a partner dance that is all about getting married? Like what is that? And so we used objects. That's actually one of the things that we've kind of consistently done throughout the show, is used objects to represent people in terms of intimacy and proximity. So like there's a partner dance where there's three people who are attached to frames and three other people that are attached to chairs, and when they get married and still like they trade objects, right? So that's also been a really fun little number, because we've been able to do lifts and things that we probably wouldn't have been able to do with the amount of time that we had, and like just without having physically trained together for 2 years before doing this show, that they're able to do, because they're not actually lifting another human, they're lifting a picture frame, or they're not necessarily balancing on somebody's hand, they're balancing their body on a chair, and right. So again, it's like we can do all kinds of very cool things that we wouldn't have been able to do had we been able to be within 6 feet of one another.
So those restrictions have almost like forced you to dig deeper.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which is, and in many ways, it's become lovely. Like, there's only a couple moments in the show that I miss being able to be within 6 feet of one another, right? Like, I mean, so much of the show, like I said, or way back, is about isolation and connection, right? And so there's a stage direction right at the beginning of the play that I think is very telling about this, that says, at no point do her parents ever touch her. And of course, we can't ever touch each other at all in this world. So like, okay, so how do we represent that isolation? And then on the flip side, at the conclusion of the play, the connection, if we can't actually get physically close to one another. So there are a couple moments that I do miss the ability to get close to one another in terms of storytelling, but for the most part I don't. For the most part, I think we've come up with really cool ways of storytelling that do the thing in some ways better than I would have told it without those restrictions.
Exciting. Yeah, really exciting.
Yeah, and I mean the thing too, right? Like again, because we were working in such a devising way, especially early on in the show, like we didn't actually start blocking the show until the second week of rehearsal. We just we're in devising land and creation land and understanding text land and whatever. But because we started in that really, really ensemble based, playful, creating with one another, like owning your own work kind of way, as we got into more complex staging things, and again, often because of COVID, we're running into like, oh my God, well, how do I get that prop off stage, or how do I get off stage, or how do we do this scene up here on this platform where there's only so much space for two people to be, and like we have to cross around each other, like how do we, all these kind of logistical issues, because we kind of created in that way in the first place. So much of the time the cast are the ones coming up with those solutions, right? Like they're in it and they just go, oh, I can, well, or what if an offering, right? So it has really been a true ensemble experience in a way, which has been so great, especially dealing with COVID, because 10 brains, or I guess 13, like our stage management team is also brilliant at coming up with cool theatrical ways of solving problems, right? Like 13 brains are better than one. So yeah, it's been crazy, but it's been a great process in some ways.
Well, and those solutions are coming from within, just like with the devising, it sounds like, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say probably like so much of what is on stage is created by the performers, right? And I've just shaped it alongside with our movement coach and our singing coach and our voice coach. There's a lot of coaches on this show, which is also lovely. It's so delightful to have such a big creative team in an ensemble show like this.
Yeah. It sounds like an incredible process, Liz. I can't wait for everybody to get to share in it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun despite all the weirdness. It's been a really good journey, and it's a really exciting show to work on, and I think we've managed to tell the story. So I don't know, we'll see. You guys tell me.
We're just a little ways from opening still.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much for chatting with me, Liz, and for sharing a little bit with everybody.
Absolutely. Thanks, Charlie.